The morning of the 12th of January, 1888, started at 41 degrees above zero across the Nebraska plains. Prairie settlers left their coats on the hooks behind their doors. Children walked to school without scarves. Women hung laundry outside because the air was almost soft, and 3 weeks of grinding cold had finally loosened its grip, and everyone was just so tired of being cold. By 2 o'clock that afternoon, the temperature at the North Platte signal station had dropped to -11. By midnight, it was -35. In the 14 hours between the warm morning and that midnight reading, somewhere between 200 and 500 people died across Nebraska, Kansas, and Dakota Territory. Nobody could agree on the exact number, because many of the dead were not found until April, when the snow finally pulled back. Some were discovered within 50 yards of their own front doors. Some were found frozen upright, still facing the direction of home. The wind that afternoon moved at 60 miles per hour. The snow was so fine it had no texture. People who survived it described breathing it in like flour, said it burned going down. Visibility dropped to 3 feet. The world beyond arm's reach ceased to exist. History would eventually name it the Schoolhouse Blizzard or the Children's Blizzard, because so many of the dead were children caught outside between their schoolhouses and their homes at the moment the cold arrived. Teachers made decisions in seconds that they spent the rest of their lives living with. This is a story about a woman named Britta Sorensen, 31 years old, a widow since the previous October, alone on a claim in Colfax County, Nebraska, with 2 children, a daughter of 9 named Marit, and a son of 6 named Anders, and a grey cat named Gro, that she had brought all the way from Norway in a wooden crate 7 years before. And this is a story about a single floorboard in her cabin that Gro had slept on every winter in the same spot since the day the floor was laid. Britta did not know what was beneath that floorboard. Her husband Lars had built the cabin himself in 1881, and there were things about the cabin she had never thought to question, because Lars was methodical and careful, and had a habit of building things the right way without explaining why. After he died, a slow death from the lung fever that moved through Colfax County in the dry September of 1887, she was left with the claim, the children, 2 milk cows, 11 chickens, $47.60 in a tin beneath the floorboards, and a cat who kept sleeping in the same corner of the kitchen on the same plank every single night from October to March. She had noticed it for years, but she had never asked what it meant. Lars Sorensen had come to Nebraska from Telemark, Norway, in the spring of 1880. He was 26 years old and had spent 4 winters working in the timber yard at Notre Dame, where he learned that the difference between a man who understood wood and a man who merely cut it was the difference between staying warm and freezing. He thought about heat the way most men thought about money, as something that could be earned, stored, spent, or wasted. And the difference between prosperity and ruin came down to which of those things you were doing at any given moment. He arrived in Nebraska on the Burlington Northern Line in April 1880, filed a claim on 160 acres in Colfax County, and spent his first summer doing what almost everyone else did, trying to build too fast with too little. His neighbours from the rail line had scattered across the county that spring. The Brenner family, Heinrich and his wife Greta, built a wood frame house with a cast-iron stove. They had hauled all the way from Omaha at considerable expense, a handsome Acme Queen heating stove that burned wood or coal and threw heat like a furnace for about 4 hours, before requiring another load. Heinrich had worked in a machine shop in Cologne and had complete confidence in manufactured things. He thought dugouts and soddies were for people who hadn't figured out that the 20th century was coming. His house cost him roughly $220 to build, and he was proud of it. Lars spent his first winter in a sod dugout. He dug into the east face of a low rise on the south edge of his claim. He did not tell anyone why he chose that particular spot. He said only that the rise broke the north wind, which it did, but that wasn't the whole reason. The whole reason was what he found when he dug. At 4 feet down, the earth was still frozen hard, pale, reluctant to move. At 5.5 feet, it changed. The soil went darker, wetter, almost loose, and the temperature of it against his bare hand was nothing like what he expected. He pressed his palm flat against the wall of the cut and held it there for 10 seconds, then 30. His hand was not cold. He had spent those 10 seconds waiting for the familiar pull of cold earth drawing the heat out through his skin, and it hadn't come. He knew, roughly, what he was feeling. In Telemark, the men who dug root cellars knew that you had to get down below a certain depth before the food stopped freezing. Nobody called it geothermal buffering. They called it below the frost, and they knew it mattered. But they treated it as a known fact rather than a mystery worth investigating. Lars treated everything worth knowing as a mystery worth investigating. He pushed the shovel in 6 more inches and felt the wall of the cut with his whole forearm. 50 degrees, maybe 52. In January, in Nebraska, when the air above him was somewhere around -10, the earth 6 feet down was 50 degrees. He dug another 18 inches before he stopped. Then he built his floor at that depth, laid his sleeping platform on the earthen floor, and spent his first Nebraska winter warmer than any of his neighbors. The following spring, 1881, he built the cabin. It went up over the dugout, not instead of it. The dugout became the foundation, the cellar, the belly of the house, accessed through a hatch in the kitchen floor that he cut from a single plank of heavy oak, and fitted so precisely into its frame that when it was closed, you could not see the seam unless you knew to look for it. He chinked the cabin walls with a mixture of clay and flax straw. He built a masonry stove from limestone and firebrick he hauled from the quarry at Schuyler, not a thin sheet iron stove like the neighbours had, but a dense block of stone and brick that weighed roughly 1,400 pounds when finished. It took 3 days to cure the first fire. After that, 1 firing in the morning and 1 at night kept the cabin at 60 degrees, even when the air outside was 20 below. Britta arrived from Norway in August of 1881 with Gro in a wooden crate and married Lars at the land office in Schuyler the day after she stepped off the train. She was 24 years old, had worked as a dairy hand in Telemark since she was 12, and had calloused hands and very clear ideas about what she thought was worth arguing about, which was not much. She was not a woman who asked unnecessary questions. If Lars had built the floor a certain way, the floor was built a certain way, and she trusted that he had his reasons. She noticed the cat's habit by the 1st December. Gro would circle the kitchen in the evening, check the area near the stove, check under the table, and then settle onto a specific plank in the northwest corner of the kitchen, about 2 feet from the wall, and sleep there until morning. Britta watched this happen 11, 12, 15 times before she thought to kneel down and put her own palm on the plank. The plank was warm, not hot, not stove warm, but noticeably, measurably warmer than the planks on either side of it. She pressed her palm on the next board, and it was cold. The board after that was cold, and the warm board was warm again, the way a sun-warmed stone stays warm an hour after the sun has moved. She asked Lars about it. He said he had built the firebox of the masonry stove on a stone ledge that extended underground, and the heat moved through the stone and through the earth into the floor at that corner. He said it with the mild matter-of-factness of a man explaining how a door latch works, and she said, "Ah," and that was the end of it. She did not ask what else was beneath the floor. Lars died in October 1887. The lung fever came up from the river bottoms in September and moved through the county in the dry heat of late summer, taking the very old and the very young and, occasionally, men of 33, in apparently good health, who simply got it worse than others. Lars ran a temperature for 6 days, burning up the reserves his body had spent 6 years building, and on the 7th day the fever broke and he seemed to be recovering, and on the 8th day he was dead. Marit was 8 at the time and understood what had happened. Anders was 5 and did not fully, and kept asking for a week when Papa was coming back from town. Britta buried him herself on the claim, because the ground was still warm enough to work, in a spot Lars had once mentioned he liked, because from there you could see all the way to the cottonwoods along Shell Creek. She said the Norwegian words from memory, the ones her own father had said at her mother's grave 20 years before, and then she went back inside and took inventory. What she had: the claim, which was proved up 6 years, full title, the cabin, the masonry stove, and its underground firebox, 2 milk cows, Rudd and Hevet, 11 chickens, $47.60. Enough corn fodder and sacked hay to last through March if she was careful. A woodpile that Lars had spent the previous 2 summers building, mostly cottonwood and some elm, Lars had hauled from the creek, cut and split, and stacked against the north side of the barn. What she did not have was any help. Lars's brother Nils had a claim 11 miles east and had visited once in 3 years. Her nearest neighbour, Heinrich Brenner, was 1.5 miles north, across open ground. The neighbour who told her she had no chance of making it through was not Heinrich Brenner. It was Ernst Vogel, who worked the claim between Britta's and the road, and who had a way of delivering bad news with what he believed was compassion, but which landed invariably as contempt. He came by in early November, sat at her table without removing his hat, drank her coffee, and told her that the county agent in Schuyler had word of a bad winter coming, colder than the last 3, possibly colder than 1,880. He said it was not personal, it was practical. A woman alone with 2 children, with the fuel situation she had, with no man to cut more wood and no money to buy coal, would not make it through a hard January. He said she should think about moving in with the Brenners through the winter, or sending the children to her brother-in-law Nils. Britta thanked him for the coffee and showed him the door. She was not dismissing the danger, she was calculating it. She knew the woodpile, roughly 12 cords of cut wood, stacked and dry. A sheet iron stove burned through 2 cords a month in hard cold. The Acme Queen that Heinrich Brenner was so proud of could do the same in a month of real winter, maybe faster if the cold went deep. 12 cords sounded like a lot until you did that arithmetic. Britta's masonry stove was not a sheet iron stove, and the difference between the two was the difference between chasing warmth all winter and storing it. A sheet iron stove is essentially a box. You build a fire in it, the iron heats up, the iron radiates heat into the room, and when the fire dies, the iron cools in 20 minutes and the heat is gone. A masonry stove, 1,400 pounds of limestone and firebrick, with a firebox built on a stone ledge that extended into the floor, works on an entirely different principle. The mass absorbs the fire's heat during a hot, fast burn, then radiates it back slowly for hours after the fire is out. Dense stone has a specific heat capacity of roughly 0.22 British thermal units per pound per degree Fahrenheit. At 1,400 pounds, the firebox of Lars's stove could absorb and store more than 60,000 BTU in a single good firing. A standard room requires about 8,000 to 10,000 BTU per hour to maintain 60 degrees when it's 0 outside. That means one good morning firing could release heat steadily for 6 to 8 hours, and another evening firing could carry through the night. 1 cord of dry cottonwood lasted Britta 3 weeks in hard cold. At that rate, 12 cords was 36 weeks the whole winter and half of spring. She would not run out of fuel. But even knowing all of that, she was not entirely sure she would be all right. Because 12 cords was 12 cords only, if nothing went wrong, if she didn't get sick, if the cows didn't need extra care, if the coal didn't go deeper than she had wood for. She spent the first 3 weeks of November doing what she always did when she was uncertain, which was work. She split the pieces Lars had left too large to stack cleanly. She reinforced the chinking on the north wall of the cabin with fresh clay mixed with dried grass. She moved the chickens from the coop into the barn, closer to the cows, so that Rode and Havit's body heat, each cow put out somewhere between 3,000 and 6,000 BTU per hour, the same as a small furnace would keep the chickens from freezing in the deep cold without any additional fuel. She stacked hay bales against the north and west exterior walls of the cabin as an outer layer of insulation, bales that had nowhere else to go and which would cut the wind from those walls entirely. And one afternoon in the second week of November, Marit came in from school and sat at the table doing her arithmetic, and Gro jumped up onto the warm plank and tucked his paws under his chest. And Britta stood in the kitchen watching the cat and thought, what else is down there? She pulled the hatch that evening after supper, after the children were in bed. The hatch opened easily, which told her Lars had kept it greased and working. The hinges were iron, well fitted. She took the lamp down with her and stood at the bottom of the ladder, looking around at what her husband had built beneath her house. The dugout floor was 7 feet below the cabin floor. The walls were lined with split limestone, not just piled but mortared with clay and lime, fitted carefully against the earth. The ceiling, the underside of the cabin floor, was low but not oppressive, maybe 6.5 feet at its highest point. The space was perhaps 14 feet wide and 20 feet long. It ran almost the entire footprint of the cabin. She held the lamp up and went slowly around the perimeter. On the north wall, below the kitchen, was the underside of Lars's masonry firebox, its stone ledge protruding 8 inches into the space. She pressed her hand against the stone. It was warmer than the air around it, not hot, but warm, radiating gently like a stone in late afternoon sun. On the east side were wooden shelves, Lars built, solid and level, holding the preserved goods she had put up that summer. Jars of pickled beets, dried corn, sauerkraut, dried beans in cloth sacks. She had known about those shelves. She had used them. She had not been far enough into the dugout to see what was behind them. Behind the shelves, on the east wall, stacked and covered under a canvas that Lars had waxed to keep moisture off, were 8 cords of split wood. She counted the rows twice. 8 cords of split elm and cottonwood, cut fine, dry, stacked perfectly, invisible behind a row of shelves holding pickle jars. Lars had spent 2 summers cutting and splitting that wood, and she had watched him work and assumed it was all going onto the outdoor pile. But some of it, 8 cords, the equivalent of 2 winters of fuel for the masonry stove, had gone down here, underground, below the frost line, where it would stay dry regardless of what happened above, where no ice storm could glaze it to the ground and make it inaccessible, where no blizzard-driven snow could bury it, where it would be there in the absolute worst case, when everything above ground had failed. She thought about asking him why he had never told her. Then she remembered that Lars almost never explained his preparations because he thought preparations that needed explaining were probably unnecessary. You either needed them or you didn't, and when you needed them, there was no time for explanation. On the south wall, against the earth, a second row of shelves, lower to the ground, covered with the same waxed canvas. She lifted a corner. More food, enough food to be surprising. Crocks of lard, sealed. A crock of salt pork she had not accounted for in her inventory because she had not known it was here. Dried beef, wrapped in cloth. A 20-pound sack of dried corn. A 10-pound sack of oats. 2 glass jars of rendered tallow that she recognized as being from the cow they had slaughtered in August 1886, preserved for more than a year, still good. She lifted the canvas further and found, in the corner, a small iron container that she recognized as a fire starter, filled with char cloth material that catches a spark and holds it long enough to start a fire from flint and steel, the kind Lars had been made to carry as a boy in Telemark, where men who went into the mountains in winter carried char cloth because wet matches were a death sentence. Lars had known something, or feared something, and had built for it without saying so. She sat on the earthen floor of the dugout with the lamp turned low to save the oil, and stayed there a long time, thinking. The temperature at the bottom of that 7-foot dugout, she realized, was nothing like the temperature in the cabin above. She was not shivering. The draft that pushed cold air through every gap in the cabin walls did not reach her here. The earth itself was holding the air at something around 50 degrees, and the warmth bleeding off the base of the masonry stove's firebox added a few degrees more. If she were to bring the children down here, if the cabin above became too cold to maintain, if the stove failed, if the cold went deeper than the wood could fight, they could survive for days in this space, weeks possibly, if they managed the food carefully. The earth would not let them freeze. She understood, for the first time, why Lars had chosen that particular rise on the south edge of the claim, not just for the windbreak. For the depth of the frost line on a south-facing slope, where the sun hit the hillside enough in summer to push the frost line down, to keep the earth warmer, to make that 50-degree buffer at 7 feet a certainty rather than a possibility. He had chosen the site because of what was underground. She blew out the lamp, climbed the ladder, closed the hatch, went to bed, and lay awake for a long time thinking about the cat. Gro had been sleeping on that plank for 6 years. The plank directly above the south edge of the masonry stove's underground firebox, where the warmth leaked up through the stone and the wood and made that one board, in that one corner, slightly warmer than any other surface in the kitchen. The cat had found the warmest spot in the house by the 2nd week they lived there, because cats do exactly that. They have temperature-sensitive receptors in their foot pads that can detect differences of a single degree Celsius between surfaces, a sensitivity so precise that researchers measuring it in the 1970s called it remarkable, and what they found was that a cat walking across a floor is effectively reading the floor's thermal map in real time. Gro had been pointing at the warm spot for 6 years. Britta had known there was something warm below the floor. She had simply never followed the warmth to its source. The cold that November was not unusual, and December was hard but manageable. The masonry stove ran exactly as Lars had built it to run. One morning firing, one evening firing, the stone holding its warmth through the long nights, the cabin maintaining 58 to 62 degrees, while the air outside stayed between 10 and 20 below. The cows in the barn stayed warm enough because the barn was banked with hay, and the 2 animals together put out roughly 10,000 BTU per hour between them, enough to keep the interior of the barn 15 to 20 degrees, warmer than the outside air without any additional heat source. Britta told no one about the wood in the dugout. She told no one about the food. She was not keeping a secret so much as she was keeping a reserve, and reserves announced are reserves that get borrowed against. Ernst Vogel stopped by twice in December to check on her, each time staying long enough to note that she seemed to be managing despite what he had predicted, and each time leaving with a slightly puzzled expression, as if the situation violated his expectations of what widows could do. He had a theory, which he shared with Heinrich Brenner at the feed store in Schuyler the 2nd week of December, that she was burning through her fuel faster than she realized and would hit the wall in February. Heinrich Brenner said he hoped not. He was not an unkind man. He had simply built his house the way he knew how to build houses, and he assumed the same principles that governed German construction governed Nebraska construction. And he had been fortunate that the previous 3 winters were mild enough to make that assumption survivable. January came. The first 10 days of January were cold, but ordinary 10 to 15 below at night, 5 to 10 above during the day. Britta kept the children in school because the walk was 3/4 of a mile, and she had taught Marit and Anders the only rule that mattered about walking in Nebraska winter. If the sky goes wrong, don't wait to see how wrong it goes. Come home, don't stop for anything, come straight home. On the morning of the 12th of January, 1888, the sky was clear and the temperature at dawn was 22 degrees above zero. By 8 o'clock it had climbed to 38. Britta sent the children to school without heavy coats, because at 38 degrees in January, heavy coats were sweaty and clumsy, and Marit had complained about them for 3 days. She stood at the door and watched them go. At 10:30 in the morning, the temperature was 41 degrees, and she hung the laundry. At 12:30, she was back inside, making the noon meal when Gro jumped down from the warm plank, went to the door, and sat facing it with his tail wrapped around his feet. She had never seen the cat do that before. She opened the door. The sky to the northwest was wrong, not dark wrong, not the colour of an ordinary storm. It was a specific brown-grey, the colour of creek mud in winter, and it was moving, not the way clouds move when wind pushes them, but the way a wall moves when it falls. The entire northwestern quadrant of the sky was coming toward her at a speed she did not have a word for, and the air at the door was still 40 degrees, and the contrast between that warmth and what she was seeing was so disorienting that she stood there for a full 6 seconds before she moved. She got outside in 20 seconds with the wooden rattle Lars had made for exactly this purpose, a noisemaker that could be heard over wind, louder and more directional than a bell. She stood on the porch and rattled it in the direction of the schoolhouse, and kept rattling until she saw 2 figures running across the open field. Marit with her arm out behind her, pulling Anders by the hand, both of them running with their coats open because it had been 40 degrees when they left for school, and nobody had told them to button up. They were 200 yards away when the front hit. The temperature dropped 30 degrees in 8 minutes. Britta grabbed both children at the porch steps and got them inside, and closed the door, and the wind came screaming around the north corner of the cabin like something that had been holding its breath for 100 miles. The thermometer on the north wall of the kitchen, which had read 41 degrees at 10:30, read 9 degrees above zero by 1 o'clock. By 2 it was 4 below. By 4 o'clock it was 17 below, and the wind was pushing snow through the gaps around the doorframe that Lars had chinked 3 times, and which had never leaked before. She built the evening fire 2 hours early and built it hot, letting the masonry stove stone absorb as much as it could before she banked it down for the slow overnight burn. She stuffed rags into the door gaps. She moved the children's sleeping pallets close to the firebox wall. She went to the barn in a rope she had fixed to the porch post specifically because Lars had told her once that people died 30 feet from their own barns in whiteouts, not from cold but from direction. They stepped off the porch and lost the barn and walked in circles until they couldn't walk anymore. She felt the cows and felt their warm sides and counted the chickens and came back. The temperature outside at midnight was negative 31 degrees. Inside the cabin, 58 degrees. The wind on the night of January 12 drove snow through every gap that had ever been in that cabin, and a few it apparently invented for the occasion. By morning, a drift had built against the north door to a depth of 3 feet, and the door would not open. The thermometer outside, which Britta could read through the east-facing window, read negative 35 at 7 in the morning. The masonry stove was radiating steadily, doing exactly what Lars had designed it to do. The morning firing was 2 hours away, and the cabin was still 54 degrees from last night's firing, the stone giving back what it had stored. She did not open the hatch that first day, because the cabin was holding. She opened it on the second day, when the temperature outside dropped to negative 39, and the wind began to find the gaps in the west wall, chinking that the first night's cold had loosened. She had Anders carry his pallet down first, then Marit, then she made 2 trips for the food stores she wanted accessible, and a 3rd trip for the quilts from the bedroom. She brought Gro down in her arms, and the cat, once at the bottom of the ladder, walked directly to the base of the masonry stove's underground firebox, pressed himself against the warm stone, and closed his eyes. The temperature at the floor of the dugout was 51 degrees. The masonry stove's underground firebox, which extended through the cabin floor on its stone ledge, was radiating quietly into the space, not aggressively, not dramatically, but steadily, the way a body radiates warmth, the way a heated stone in a sleeping bag radiates warmth, the way Earth itself radiates warmth from its own internal heat, consistent and patient, and utterly indifferent to what the air was doing, 40 degrees away and 37 feet up. She rationed the underground wood carefully, taking only what each day's firing needed and no more. She did not use the underground food except what she planned from the start of each week, setting it against what they needed and eating nothing in excess. Anders slept against the warm stone of the firebox base with Gro pressed against his back, and he slept better those 4 nights in the dugout than he had in months. Marit asked if they were going to die, and Britta told her no. She told her that her father had built this house so that they could not die in it, even if they did not know it. She told her that the earth itself was keeping them warm, that 6 feet of soil and stone was doing what no amount of firewood could do. It was holding a temperature that was 50 degrees higher than the air outside, and all they had to do was stay inside it. Marit thought about this and then asked how the earth stayed warm. Britta told her what she understood of it, which was not perfectly scientific but was accurate enough. The earth is not cold all the way down. The sun warms the top, but the warmth goes down slowly, and it takes so long to leave that by the time it's gone from deep down, the new warmth from the next summer has already arrived. The frost reaches down, but it only reaches so far. Below where it reaches, the ground stays warm enough. Your father found that warmth and put a floor on top of it. Marit thought about that and then asked how the cat knew. Britta said, Gro knew because his feet could feel things that ours cannot. He was always looking for the warmest spot, and he found it the first winter we were here, and he slept on it every night because warmth is the most important thing, and he did not waste it when he found it. On the second day, in the mid-afternoon, someone knocked on the cabin door above. She climbed the ladder and opened the door to find Heinrich Brenner standing on the porch with snow in his beard and a look on his face that she had never seen there before, which was genuine fear. His Acme Queen stove had cracked. Cast iron fails in deep cold when it is heated unevenly. The metal contracts and expands at different rates in different sections, and a crack develops, and through the crack the heat goes, and the fire goes out. And it cannot be relit without a new stove, because the crack allows cold air in faster than the fire can heat it. This was not a common failure, but -35 with a 50-mile wind was not a common situation, and the Queen had not been built for it. The cabin temperature in Brenner's house, when he left, was 22 degrees above zero and falling. Greta Brenner was inside with their 3 children. She had all the quilts and blankets on them and had moved them into the kitchen, but the kitchen was 700 square feet, with a single south-facing window and a cracked stove, and the cold was going to find them regardless. Britta said bring them here, simply, without drama, without making him ask twice. She went down the ladder and rearranged the space and made room. Heinrich went back for his family in a rope line. She gave him Lars's barn rope for the return trip, so they had something to hold between them across the open ground. They arrived 40 minutes later, Greta, red-faced and shaking, and the 3 Brenner children ranging from 4 to 11, all of them buried in blankets that had still not been enough. The temperature at the bottom of the dugout was 51 degrees. The Brenners had been in 22 and dropping. They sat on Britta's earthen floor with their backs against the warm stone of Lars's firebox, and did not say much for the first hour. Heinrich said, finally, "What is this place?" And Britta told him, because there was no longer any reason not to. She told him about the depth 7 feet, below the frost line. She told him about the earth's steady 50 degrees. She told him about the masonry stove's underground firebox and how the heat bled through the stone. She told him about the firewood stacked behind the shelves. He looked at the stacked wood for a long time, 8 cords, stacked dry and clean in a space that the cold could not reach. Then he looked at the cat, who had relocated to the warmest available person, which was currently the smallest Brenner child. and was sleeping on the child's legs with the expression of complete indifference that cats wear when they are exactly where they want to be. He said, "Your husband built all this?" She said, "Yes." He said, "I have been building houses for 12 years and I did not know to do any of this." She said, "He grew up in Telemark. The winters are different there. You learn to go below." The Schoolhouse Blizzard of the 12th of January, 1888, ran for 3 days across Nebraska before the temperature began its slow climb back towards survivable. The minimum recorded at North Platte was -35 degrees. At Fargo, Dakota Territory, newspapers reported -47. Fort Keogh, Montana, recorded -65 degrees on January 14, the coldest temperature the contiguous United States had ever recorded to that point. Schools across the region made fateful decisions in the first 90 minutes of the storm's arrival. Some teachers kept children in their schoolhouses, burning desks and floors for fuel when the wood ran out, and those children lived. Some teachers led their students out into the storm toward homes that were too far, and those children did not. Minnie Freeman, 19 years old, teaching at the Midvale Schoolhouse near Ord, Nebraska, tied her 13 students together with twine when the storm tore the roof off her schoolhouse and led them one at a time to a farmhouse half a mile away. She received a gold medal from the Nebraska State Education Board and more than 80 marriage proposals from strangers who read about her in the papers. Lois Royce, also a teenager, lost all 3 of the children she led out from her school near Plainview, despite the boarding house being only 82 yards away. Etta Shattuck, 19, survived 78 hours in a haystack with no food and no water before being found, and both legs were amputated. The death toll at the end of the storm was contested and would remain so. The most conservative official count was 235, and David Laskin, who researched the storm exhaustively, concluded the true number was closer to 500, with many of the dead not found for weeks. In Colfax County, Nebraska, on a claim on the south edge of a low rise, where the frost line ran a little deeper than the open plain, because of the way the hillside caught the sun, a woman named Britta Sorensen and 5 Brenner family members spent 3 days and 4 nights at 51 degrees, while the world above them tried to kill everything it could find. On the 4th morning, when the temperature had climbed back to -8 and the wind had dropped to something manageable, Britta climbed the ladder, opened the hatch, and went out to see to the cows. Rod and Havit were alive. The barn interior, with the 2 animals together and the hay bale banking on the outside walls, had maintained roughly 20 degrees through the worst of it, cold but survivable for cattle that were otherwise healthy and had adequate fodder. The chickens, 12 of them now instead of 11 because one had hatched an egg Britta hadn't noticed, were alive in the corner of the barn where the cow's body heat pooled against the north wall. She went back inside and told the children the cows were all right. Anders asked if Gro was hungry. Gro was not. Gro was sitting on the warm stone again, attending to something on his left ear with complete concentration. Indifferent to the historic cold, he had helped them survive by sitting in the same corner of the kitchen for 6 winters until someone finally thought to look beneath the floor. There are really only a few ways heat moves through a building, and understanding those pathways is the difference between a structure that holds warmth and one that bleeds it. Heat moves by conduction, direct contact between surfaces, one warm thing touching one cold thing, the warmth transferring across the boundary. It moves by convection, warm air rising, cold air sinking, the constant churning that moves heat through open spaces. And it moves by radiation, the direct emission of infrared energy from a warm surface, which travels without needing any material to move through, the same way sunlight travels through the vacuum of space. A standard frontier cabin in 1888, built with 1-inch pine boards and chinking that loosened every winter, lost heat through all 3 pathways simultaneously and continuously. The iron stove heated the air, but heated air rose to the ceiling and sat there while cold air pooled at the floor and the children's feet. The heat that moved into the walls moved by conduction through the thin boards and then by convection through the cold air outside and was gone. Every gap in the chinking was a convection path, a direct circuit from inside warmth to outside cold. Lars Sorensen had solved 2 of these problems without having the vocabulary for either solution. The masonry stove solved the storage problem. A cast iron stove is a heat emitter. You feed it, it glows, and when you stop feeding it, the glow fades in minutes. A masonry stove, 1,400 pounds of stone and firebrick, is a heat battery. You charge it with a hot, fast fire, the stone absorbs far more energy than thin iron ever could, and then it discharges that energy slowly over the next 8 to 12 hours. The stone surface temperature stays warm rather than hot, which means it radiates heat continuously rather than intensely, and that gentle, continuous radiation warms surfaces and bodies rather than just air. The Koreans had understood this for 2,000 years with their ondol systems, heated floors, stone beneath the sleeping surface, and the Chinese with their kang. Lars had built a version of it from Nebraska limestone and firebrick by pure practical logic, without the name for it. The dugout solved the insulation problem. The earth at 7 feet in Nebraska maintains roughly 50 degrees year-round, and this is not a small advantage. The walls of a standard cabin might be 1 inch of pine, which has an R value of about 1.25, which is almost nothing. The earth on all sides of a 7-foot dugout is an insulating layer of effectively infinite thickness, with an R value per foot of somewhere between R1 and R2, but backed by the constant temperature of the geothermal baseline, which means no matter how cold it gets above, the temperature below never drops. The dugout doesn't need to be heated to 50 degrees, it starts at 50 degrees. Every BTU of additional heat that enters the space stays there, because the walls of Earth don't conduct heat away the way thin boards do. 50 degrees feels cold to people accustomed to modern indoor temperatures, but 50 degrees will not freeze food, will not freeze water, will not freeze a person who is clothed and has adequate calories. 50 degrees, with body heat from 7 people and a cat, and the radiant leakage from the stove's underground firebox, was probably closer to 58. Heinrich Brenner's Acme Queen had cracked because it was doing all the work. Lars's system distributed the work between the masonry battery and the earth, so each component carried only part of the load. The stove provided the heat gradient above 50 degrees. The earth provided the base. Together they were more than enough. After the thaw, the spring of 1888 came differently than most springs did. It came as a relief so acute, it had almost a physical texture. People who had spent 3 days and nights wondering if it was going to keep getting colder until there was no cold left to be found, came out of their houses blinking, into the March sun, and stood in the mud, and did not say very much. Ernst Vogel came by Britta's cabin in the first week of April. He stood on the porch and told her he was glad she had made it, and that he had underestimated her situation, which was as close to an apology as Ernst Vogel was constitutionally capable of producing. She gave him coffee, and did not make him feel worse than he already felt, because that was not the kind of person she was. Heinrich Brenner came by in late April to help her with some of the spring work she couldn't do alone, bringing his oldest son to split wood. While the boy worked at the woodpile, Heinrich and Britta sat in the kitchen, and he asked her to explain the masonry stove again, the underground firebox, the depth of the dugout. He had a notebook, and he took notes. He was going to rebuild. He was going to do it right this time. She told him everything she knew, which was everything Lars had left for her to find. The cat slept on the warm plank throughout the conversation. The plank was no longer the warmest surface in the cabin. The spring sun had warmed the whole floor, but Gro slept there anyway, out of habit, or out of memory, or out of whatever combination of those things governs where a cat decides to be. Marit, 9 years old, watched the cat from across the kitchen and then looked at her mother and said, "Is that why you said to pay attention to where he sleeps?" Britta said yes. She had told both children this the previous December. She did not remember saying it, but Marit remembered. She said, "Pay attention to where the cat sleeps. He always knows where it's warm. And in this house, the warm spot is also the safe spot. And the safe spot is the thing your father built." The Schoolhouse Blizzard changed Nebraska and Dakota Territory in ways that are still visible if you know where to look. In its immediate aftermath, the territorial and state legislatures across the region were deluged with requests for better weather communication, more reliable forecasts, some way of knowing that a wall of cold was coming before it arrived, and stripped 40 degrees off the air in 8 minutes. The Signal Corps, the Army's weather monitoring branch, came under severe criticism for failing to forecast the storm and for actively suppressing warnings from field stations that had seen it coming. Congress overhauled the Civilian Weather Service in 1890, creating what eventually became the National Weather Service. At the individual homestead level, the response was less institutional and more architectural. Settlers who had survived by luck or by better building were suddenly the people their neighbours wanted to talk to. Dugouts and root cellars, which had been considered crude or temporary by settlers who had moved to wood frame houses, experienced a small revival of respect. The geothermal logic that Lars Sorensen had applied to his claim was not unique to him. It was known to homesteaders who had arrived without resources and been forced to go underground. And it was known to the German-Russian immigrants who had settled the central Dakotas and brought clay stove construction from the Black Sea colonies. What the blizzard did was provide a dramatic, unmistakable demonstration of which systems had worked and which had not. Cast iron stoves were not abandoned. They were too convenient, too available, too familiar. But the men who sold them began to encounter questions they had not encountered before. How long does it hold heat after the fire goes out? What happens in 40 below? Can it crack? These were Britta's questions. She had answered them before she needed to, because Lars had answered them before she asked. The children grew up on that claim. Marit Sorensen was still living on the property in 1924, when she was interviewed by a writer from the Schuyler Sun who was doing a piece on old homestead buildings in Colfax County. She was 44 years old by then, and the cabin had been expanded twice, and the masonry stove had been replaced once when part of the firebox cracked in 1902, though she had the replacement built by a German mason from Schuyler, who knew exactly the principles Lars had used and replicated them in. The new construction, same depth, same stone ledge into the dugout, same thermal mass. She told the writer about the blizzard. She told him about the Brenner family in the dugout. She told him about the wood behind the shelves and the food under the canvas and the $47 in the tin. The writer asked if she ever figured out why her father hadn't told her mother about the supplies. She said, "I don't think he saw any reason to. He didn't build it to be a surprise. He built it because he thought they might need it. He was the kind of man who built things in case they were needed, and if they weren't needed, he didn't mention it. And if they were needed, he didn't need to, the thing was already there." The writer asked about the cat. She smiled and said Gro had lived to be 19 years old, which is a remarkable age for a cat, and that her mother had never again chosen a place to sleep or a place to build anything without asking where the cat wanted to sit first. Here is something that most people who live in heated houses, with thermostats and gas furnaces and insulated walls, have no reason to know. The ground beneath your feet is not cold. 5 feet below the surface in Nebraska, the soil temperature in January is somewhere between 38 and 45 degrees Fahrenheit. 6 feet down, it climbs toward 50. 7 feet down, in a south-facing hillside where summer sun has been depositing thermal energy for months, it can be 52 or 53 degrees. This temperature does not swing with the seasons in any dramatic way. It is stable. The Earth is a battery. It charges all summer, and it discharges slowly, and the charge is deep enough and the discharge rate slow enough that the temperature at depth barely moves between August and February. This is the same physical principle that keeps wine caves at a constant cool temperature, that makes caves feel cold in summer and warm in winter, that makes root vegetables stored in a proper deep cellar last through February without freezing. The Earth generates its own heat from radioactive decay in its mantle and core, and that heat works its way up, and combined with the solar energy stored in summer, it creates a thermal buffer zone at depth that nothing on the surface can replicate without significant fuel investment. A furnace heats a house by adding energy from outside. A deep dugout heats itself by sitting inside the Earth's existing thermal field. The furnace stops when the fuel stops. The Earth does not stop. Lars Sorensen understood this because he had worked in Telemark, where the men who built root cellars for the estates understood that the deeper you went, the warmer the winter storage. He applied that understanding to a cabin in Nebraska and arrived at something close to what the Korean architects of the Ondol system had understood for 2,000 years. If you put your floors where the Earth is warm, and you add a thermal battery to boost the temperature above that baseline, you have created a home that the cold cannot fully enter. The cat knew this without any of the reasoning. Cats have heat receptors in the pads of their feet that can detect temperature differences between surfaces as small as 1 degree Celsius. A cat walking across a floor is reading the floor the way a hand reads a page of Braille. Grow found the warm plank in his first Nebraska winter because the warm plank was the most important spot in the house, the most comfortable, yes, but also the spot above which the Earth's thermal buffer was closest to the surface, where the stone base of the masonry stove was conducting gentle warmth upward through 7 feet of earth and 6 inches of oak plank. Britta spent 6 years watching the cat and thinking it was a preference. It was a map. The dugout beneath the Sorensen cabin was still in use in 1924, according to Merritt's account. The stone walls were original. The firebox extension was on its second rebuilding. The shelves were different shelves, but in the same positions. And the temperature at the bottom in January, when Merritt went down to get preserves or check on the seed potatoes stored in the northwest corner, was somewhere between 50 and 52 degrees, the same as it had been in 1887. The same as it had been when Lars first felt the wall of that cut with his bare forearm and held his hand there and waited for the cold to come, and it didn't. The Earth is patient. The Earth does not hurry. The Earth holds its warmth at depth through every winter that has ever happened and every winter that is coming, because the physics of it don't care about the calendar and don't care about the weather and don't require anyone to understand them in order to work. All they require is someone willing to go deep enough to find them.